Amongst the various genres that exist in media, horror has always been one I've shied away from. As children, we always fear boogeymen, monsters, and creatures we don't understand, and presumably exist to do us harm. As adults, those fears compound and either dissipate entirely or morph into something more existential. We no longer fear made-up creatures, but we remain capable of fearing ideas, certain suggestions or trains of thought, and what implications they may bring. What remains a constant throughout our lives is that fear is derived from things we don't understand or refuse to understand. And this has been true right from the dawn of humanity, from the days of playing the hunter-gatherer against the wild, to the relatively sheltered beings we are today. Fear never entirely escapes us. Some of us seek to relive those experiences, to have a rush of epinephrine as we dip our toes into territories that send chills down our spine. We derive this morbid fascination from exposing ourselves to the uncanny, the unknown. This need not be limited to physical scares, which are more startling than horrifying. There's a reason that the best horror is psychological. An entity like the Slender Man may seem cheesy looking back at the mania surrounding him a couple years ago. But that came from a result of overexposure and a degree of cultural normalization. What makes him terrifying isn't a backstory, it's the mere suggestion of his existence, it's what he represents. Originating from a 2009 Photoshop contest and what grew into a household horror by 2014, it's clear looking back that what was eerie wasn't just a picture of a faceless man, but everything that grew to surround him up until that point. The jump scare at the end of Slender, the 8 pages, isn't what's terrifying. That something you can't explain, can't foresee, can't understand might take your life is. His face or lack thereof is a means to project your own anxieties onto him, almost like a customized personal boogeyman. It's why basing a film around him simply doesn't work, but playing an ARG to accompany a found footage non-linear web series was such a powerful experience for everyone directly involved. It is in this realm of what-ifs, where logical plausibility takes a backseat, where metaphor precedes reality, that the story of Alan Wake plays out. The story of Alan Wake takes place almost exclusively in the fictional American town of Bright Falls. Big enough to have its own share of diverse locales, but small enough to feel like it's in a bubble of its own, secluded from the rest of the world. It's said that real horror lives just beneath the surface of the normal and mundane, and it is in taking advantage of a relatable setting, situation, and/or characters that a horror narrative can be exponentially improved. Bright Falls feels normal enough on its own, but has this air of a reverse paper town, off the grid, one that doesn't usually let people through its borders. It's just odd enough to tickle your cerebrum as to what exactly feels ever so off about the place. It's the kind of town you'd expect to see in a Stephen King novel. Ah yes, good old Stephen King. A man so prolific his name is far from unknown outside his field of influence, which may be why he is quoted within the first moments of the game. Taken one way, it's a reference as a mark of respect for the author, to note that this game is inspired and somewhat a pastiche of his works. Taken another way, and it comes off as permission to pull some rather wacky stuff. Much like Max Payne, the story of Alan Wake isn't one that escapes being cliched and predictable. However, Sam Lake is good enough a writer to actually put these cliches to good use in both cases. They're not an easy, routine way to flesh out the narrative, but a tool to guide both the story and the player forward. They play a key role in telegraphing certain plot threads and threats to the player. The more well-versed you are with horror conventions, the more info you're given to work with. And this makes sense within the context of the setting. Alan Wake is a writer, a hackneyed one, as his own cliched works go to show, but a successful and well-regarded one within the game world nonetheless. Suffering from a writer's block and having killed off the protagonist of his hard-boiled detective series, his wife takes him on a vacation at Bright Falls. Of course, things aren't what they seem, his wife drowns at Cauldron Lake, shit starts getting surreal, and Alan realizes that the events playing out are all in accordance with a manuscript he doesn't remember writing. A dark presence that resides in Cauldron Lake seems to be responsible for what's going on, and appears to be an entity capable of manifesting an artist or creator's work. The more precise and descriptive the work of art, the more efficiently the darkness can manifest it, which is why writing seems to be the form of art most compatible with it. Even within the writing, rules must be obeyed. The magic of a story must not be lost, its self-consistency maintained throughout. The whole theme of the game comes across as rather simple and unoriginal, a tale of light versus dark if you will. The mechanics express this primarily via the most literal way possible. Enemies are people corrupted by the dark presence. Lampposts act as safe points and protect you from them. The enemies themselves are invincible until you burn away, the darkness shielding them. Pages of the manuscript are used as collectibles, and they glow both as a means to indicate their presence and as an item that benefits you by improving your understanding of the situation. The atmosphere is lively, but in the most negative sense possible. The individual episodes largely take place in forested areas, and the enveloping dread works wonderfully to make what should feel like an open area ridiculously claustrophobic. There's never a quiet moment unless it's daytime, and the night is filled with noises that pique the imagination. Enemies groan phrases repeatedly, and even when by yourself, the wind screams in your ears, harder and harder as you stray from the path you're expected to follow. The ebb and flow of your flashlight's focus as you dart it across your surroundings leaves a lingering sense of dread for all those areas that remain unlit. By forcing you to focus on immediate threats in order to make them vulnerable, it simultaneously doubles as a means of fueling your anxiety about everything that escapes the illumination of your flashlight, darting around the periphery of your vision, teasing their presence as they brush through the foliage. It's oppressive, it's intimidating. It always forces you to keep thinking at every moment about the myriad of ways that things can go wrong. Of course, the magic is ruined every time the camera pans away from you to reveal the enemies, but for the most part the atmosphere remains oppressive and gripping, likely the strongest part of the presentation for anyone who plays it. As you traverse the variety of many locations across the episodes, what you think might be a short trip to your next target gradually snowballs into a startlingly lengthy path as you look back and realize just how far you've come. It's this semi-structured, semi-player-driven gameplay that builds the mood. It sets the stage for the cutscenes to make an impact on you. On their own, they come across as cheesy schlock not worth bothering about all that much. That Alan Wake is successful is a result of it taking advantage of the medium it's in, much like Max Payne before it. But if that was all there was to it, it'd be remembered as no more than an eccentric, somewhat repetitive third-person shooter with a few twists. Give a person enough time and eventually they'll get accustomed to anything. This is where the plot and actual underlying theme of the game really shine through. But before I get to that, I want to complete examining these surface level ideas that the game presents. The game essentially likens the light versus dark debate to the freedom to have complete creative control over one's art and having to bend to the whims of publishers in order to have that art reach as many people as possible. Now, Alan's wife is his only source of positive reinforcement. Between the negative press coverage and the pressure to write newer, better novels, she's the only thing that keeps him going. She's the inspiration behind his works. The darkness, on the other hand, is a malevolent entity. It seeks to shape the art of others for its own game. It acts as a pushy publisher that twists the works of those under its patronage to serve its own ends. The psychiatrist, Emil Hartman, has been putting up a guise pretending to aid troubled musicians and writers. But he too seeks to control rather than channel their creativity for his own profits. This commercialization of creativity, clashing with the torment of the artist, is the core debate here. And it is from here that I'll transition to discussing the deeper view I have of Alan Wake's themes. The story of Alan Wake is one best taken metaphorically. Some may say that the characters are weak, but in a sense, that's kinda the idea. Its characters are less like unique people and more like tropes, stereotypes we're accustomed to seeing in various genres across different media. Alan may be deeply flawed, and rather unoriginal as a writer. His wife Alice, bland as she may seem, plays a key role solely as his muse. The level-headed sheriff, the comic sidekick, the ostensibly malicious psychiatrist, the fangirl waitress. They're less characters that exist in a real world and more characters that exist within a work of fiction. And I don't mean fiction relative to us, the people on the outside looking in. I mean within the context of the story itself. Think back to the revelation behind the existence of Thomas Zane. Zane was a prolific writer, a good writer as opposed to Alan. He visited Bright Falls back in the 70s, residing in the cabin on Divers Isle at Cauldron Lake, where the darkness touched the real world the strongest. He lost his lover, Barbara Jagger, to the lake, and was goaded by Hartman into writing her back to life using the darkness. The darkness, acting as a monkey's paw of sorts, complies with his writing, and possesses her body upon resurrecting her. Now with a vessel in the real world, the darkness poses a very tangible threat to reality itself, and in order to seal the darkness away, Zane wrote both of them out of reality. And here's where it gets interesting. The darkness exists in an alternate dimension, dubbed the Dark Place. Creative, I know. Its presence is one that supersedes human understanding, and as such, its mechanisms eluded Zane. As a contingency plan of sorts, before offing himself, Zane decided that he'd pass the baton to someone he could trust, someone he knew would be guaranteed to succeed come hell or high water. He wrote himself a protagonist that should he fail, would finish the job in his stead. Alan Wake is such an iffy character precisely because he was written as a work of fiction. The oddities exhibited by so many of the people around him are because they're secondary characters and extras. I mean, sure, that goes for any side character in a game, they're not exactly the most fleshed out of the bunch, but with this perspective, we have a sort of justification for them intentionally being so. As works of fiction, every single one of them is a sort of semi-incomplete two-dimensional character. It's supposed to come off as a bit daft. It's a self-aware horror story. When Alan writes Zane into his own story to aid him, he only has a fragment of who Zane was as a human being. And the darkness exhibits an even lower degree of creativity. It lacks the ability to come up with original, coherent ideas, hence why it relies on artists and their interpretations of reality to manifest itself. It's why everyone possessed by it is reduced to a one-dimensional shell of themselves, capable of only muttering a handful of phrases that sum up their character traits. It's why when the darkness tries to pass itself off as Alice, it doesn't take you 2 seconds to realize it's not her. This impersonation is too perfect, without flaw, and that's as far from human as you can get. Alan worries about the impact his writing has on those around him now. All the death and chaos around him, how much of that is his fault? How much of it was because he wrote it to be so? And how much of it was mere chance due to cause and effect? Could you really say that he should be held accountable for all of these deaths? Because in that case, the fault would be passed on from him to Zane, as Alan himself is Zane's own original character, do not steal. It calls into question the degree of agency exercised by fictional characters, how by maintaining convention and logic, by creating your own rule set for how your story works, you're just creating a deterministic playing field that only sees itself played out one way, the same way, every single time. From the mention of the clicker in his childhood, to the rediscovery of the very same clicker towards the finale, and every single step in between, there was only one route for Alan to follow. And a part of that route involved writing the manuscript that would shape the plot of the game. In doing so, he set everyone else's lives down a fixed path as well. Now, I'm young and inexperienced. Outside of games, my exposure to other media like film and books is still extremely limited, which is why looking up the impressions of my betters is an important part of learning about different views on games. I say this because I'd like to bring up Noah Gervais. He's someone who's read Stephen King's books, among many others, and with that experience comes knowledge that I simply cannot share as I don't have it. I've linked the relevant video in the description. I'll probably put a card up in the top right of the screen too if I can remember to do that. The first 36 minutes of that video extensively cover his views on Alan Wake and his American Nightmare. I'd like to direct your attention particularly from 1846 through to 2115, wherein he covers a particular scene from the Dark Tower series. It's not crucial to understanding the contents of this video, but it will provide an avenue for thought on the matter of creators consciously exerting control over their fiction whilst being a part of it. Towards the end of the game, Alan, having meditated over the demands of genre and the need for consistency, realizes that for his horror story to remain a horror story, he wasn't walking away from this with everything intact, and so he decides to trade himself in for his wife. He may not have been liberated physically at the end, but he was able to keep the one person he cared about safe, and to him, that was enough. Of course, the story in this genre would be woefully incomplete without some sort of revelation or realization towards the end. As Alan types away inside the lodge, now no longer a part of our reality, but in the dark place, he has some sort of epiphany and utters the iconic line.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
Alan, wake up.
This would have been a fine place to leave the story. It may not have explained everything, but it didn't need to. Alan's story could never have been a happy one, and leaving the player to ponder over what hellish experiences he must be going through is material enough to leave me satisfied. But Remedy wasn't done. They went on to create 2 pieces of DLC, The Signal and The Rider, and they cover precisely what everyone was wondering he was up to. What's most interesting about the DLCs is the change in the antagonist. The darkness is no longer an entity encroaching on the real world. From the start, it was merely a manifestation of a realm beyond our comprehension. And now, Alan is in that realm, a place where reality is fluid, where thought-form entities, birthed from the minds of people, provide ample threat to you. And the person in question responsible for the enemy sent your way? None other than Alan Wake himself. In a fit of self-destructive mania, Alan tries over and over again to kill himself, represented by the dozens of Taken who rush you at every step of the way. He writes up as much crap as he can muster in a desperate attempt to kill himself. The Alan you play, on the other hand, is far more calm and reserved, much more so than he was in the base game, as though the rational side of him is being antagonized by his emotional side. The levels are now much more erratic and ever-changing. It can be likened to an actual dreamscape, where you, the dreamer, are the one unchanging dot, as everything around you twists and morphs constantly, without seeming the slightest bit strange. I don't remember my dreams, but on the few occasions that I have attained lucidity, I can recall suddenly being in a location and having no memory of how I got there. Other times, I feel as though my lucid self is like a ghost, watching my dream self interact with the other people my dream has conjured up. I exert no control over any of it, yet I am acutely aware of everything that happens, just not the reason why. The people in my dream all seem to speak some strange, unfamiliar language, and my dream self converses with them in the same tongue. Everything feels so normal within the logic of a dream, but upon waking up it's all so absurd. And as the minutes tick by while my morning routine plays out, the dream just gradually burns out of my memory, only leaving a few ashes to remember it by. I've said it before and I'll reiterate it for emphasis. The story of Alan Wake is one that is best understood metaphorically. The dissociation between logic and emotion here takes center stage. The depressed, hopeless side of Alan, lost without the guidance and comfort of his muse to aid him through troubled times, has long since given up trying to convince his rational side that persistence is futile. The doubts that have been gnawing at him from before the game even started are no longer suppressed. He spirals madly out of control, his unstructured maniacal writing, setting a scene of pandemonium as he whips up whatever he can to kill his other half. His rational side, however, begs to differ. Not out of some naive hope he clings onto, but based on the fact that if he gives up, it's all over anyways. The difficulty of the game ramps up massively. It demands cold, hard logic through its combat from both you and Alan. It's the only way to go on. There's some clever metaphors even in its gameplay. One of the things you can do now is light up certain words in the environment to manifest whatever they represent. And emotional side Alan catches on. He starts planting the names of enemies around combat arenas, like letter mines of sorts, just waiting to be stepped on. You can no longer focus your flashlight on enemies willy-nilly, you might just dig an even deeper hole for yourself. It's brilliant. The base game begins with a tutorial, a dream that sees you guided towards a lighthouse, a safe haven for Alan, by none other than Thomas Zane, or Alan's interpretation of him, I'm not sure which. The lighthouse doesn't hold much significance in the main story, however, because Alan isn't meant to have respite. But in the DLC, when he clears his mind and has freed himself of fear, it is then that the lighthouse reappears, his beacon of hope returning to guide him to salvation, akin to a strong memory or positive emotion that can give a depressed person the drive to keep on keeping on, an anchor to the sky to make sure he never sinks too far. It's fantastic, it's kinda relatable, and most importantly, it makes Alan a likable character by portraying his halves as two sides of the same coin we all see in ourselves. Of course, it ends with a boss fight against Alan's most negative interpretations of those close to him, his worries about what they may truly think of him, how they may, deep down, really hate him. Because a man who truly hates himself is more than capable of assuring himself that the people around him have a valid reason to hate him too. But the choice to have the last person he fights be Barry, while his wife existed? I don't feel too well about its ending either. It sees Alan reconcile his two halves and immediately begin writing a manuscript titled The Return. I believe it would have made for a much better ending if, in spite of all the hardships he endured, Alan still lost in the end. If the horror story that began at Bright Falls was to stay true to genre, that story still hasn't ended. Alan simply cannot return to reality, that would ruin it entirely. Thomas Zane was selfish once. He wanted to write himself a happy ending, and as a result the darkness possessed his lover. He learned from his mistake and had the balls to set a contingency plan in place and sacrifice himself, all to ensure that the darkness was sealed away from our reality. Our boy Alan does not, however. He's either stupid, selfish, or both, because in writing up a happy ending for himself, he's simply proving that this entire ordeal has taught him nothing. He just wants to play the protagonist who wins in the end no matter the cost. And this grand illusion seems to take shape by way of Alan Wake's American nightmare, or as Noah Gervais would put it, Alan Wake's narcissistic daydream. Now, I personally see it as an arcade-style, nonsensical power fantasy that's just a goofy spin-off. It indulges the player, letting you feel like the protagonist of another third-person shooter. There's firearms aplenty, there's enemies for days, you get to watch an evil double of Alan pull some wacky shit as he replaces himself in the real world. You even watch on as Clubfoot by Kasabian plays while a satellite crashes into an oil derrick. It's like an after party to fuck around with content from the original, a final hurrah to the game that never saw a sequel. The time loop set in place to trap Alan is intriguing. The ability to run the story again and again until you get it just right is a fate much too luxurious for any other fictional character to enjoy. It's not something meant to be taken seriously in the slightest. The original far surpasses it in every way, save for the rather raucous energy of the combat here. Mr. Scratch, his evil twin on the outside, is another of Alan's awful creations. He's an amalgamation of all the gossip and negative things people have said about him in the real world that dug into his emotional side and got under his skin. He's the John Mira of this story. All his interactions with you are through none other than the good old trusty CRT. But between the awful dialogue and all the clearly low-budget conversations, good God, is any of it hard to take seriously. It's no longer a story about a writer trying to convince himself that he's a decent one. It's the story of a man and whichever gun happens to be his favorite at the moment. Sure, the game tries to tell you that there's a bit more going on here. It waves its arms saying, hey look, there's a smidgen of subtext right out of that table there. Go have a look. And even if you do somehow find a bit of subtext under that table, you can't help but feel like you're being punked. The fact that it explicitly has a dedicated arcade mode is proof enough. It bears repeating that this is a game in which playing a Kasabian CD in a certain place causes a satellite to fall from the sky and destroy an oil derrick. When all is said and done, it ends with Alan shown reunited with his wife, though this too feels fake, as though it were a delusion he pushed onto himself to maintain his sanity. Much like its arcade mode, American Nightmare's entire existence starts and ends at being nothing more than a diversion. A gun-toting, beer-swigging, rock-loving diversion, but a diversion nonetheless. That is where the story of Alan Wake leaves us. A bit disappointing of a send-off, assuming you played through American Nightmare, but that's not even mentioning all of the episodes of Night Springs you'll find across the story that far outstrip American Nightmare's own plot in terms of writing quality and mystery. The name is another mirror reference, in this case to Bright Falls, and the show itself is a homage to the Twilight Zone. The location of Night Springs isn't one that's physical. Rather, it is described as merely a name that attaches itself to a place where strange things are happening. Much like its predecessor, Address Unknown, it's the only component of the game to feature real people instead of character models. The contents are also comparatively much more coherent, and for those who haven't seen it, you might want to consider watching some of this stuff. It's surprisingly decent, and helps color whatever you take away from the experience of playing this game, with stories that can alter your perspective. Alan Wake is well worth at least the first 16-hour playthrough. It's another solid entry from the studio that seek to use external influences to build a game, from film, from books, and whatever goes on inside the head of Sam Lake. And I, for one, firmly believe that they succeeded in doing so. Around the 12th of May, 2017, Alan Wake was pulled from digital storefronts. The licensing deal for the copyright music it used only lasted 7 years. And for a while, it looked like the only way to get your hands on it was to borrow a physical copy or to sail the high seas. But 5 days ago, the game saw its return, alongside a hefty 80% discount until the end of Halloween. So if you haven't played it already, or if you originally bought it for the 360 and would love to revisit it on a PC, that's your station call. I reckon this video won't be finished by Halloween, which is a crying shame if this is how you found out about it. But it should be around $15 or your regional equivalent at full price, and will probably drop down again to $3 around the holiday season. So there's that to look forward to. That's all for now though. Hope to see you in the next video, where I'll probably wind up tearing Quantum Break a new one.
There's an altar wrought with mystery of Tom the poet and his muse, and a magic lake which gave a light to the